we have a Brian Baldock, Senior Program Manager from Microsoft, and also Eric DeLorme, Senior Program Manager from Microsoft Canada to join today's session. Brian is a Senior Program Manager specializing in Exchange Online and security with over 10 years of experience and a demonstrated history of success helping customers modernize information technology and improve security posture. And Brian specializes in identity and access management, email migration, VMware infrastructure, and Windows Server infrastructure. And for Eric, Eric is a senior program manager at Microsoft Canada. During his 15 years at Microsoft, he has worked as a consultant, technical specialist, global black belt, and that's a term I need to ask Eric, MWA. So maybe Eric can comment on that. He specializes in helping customers design, deploy, and modernize their endpoint computing environments. And Brian and Eric were together to deliver a session called Zero Trust Demystified.
So Brian Baldock, Senior Program Manager, also a Modern Work Architect, which is also the abbreviation that we were referring to earlier, which is the MWA space. So I do the same job as Eric with a lot of financial industry customers, and Eric has been in a lot of different roles at Microsoft, and so this is going to be a fun presentation. It's going to be interesting. So I guess what we could do, Eric, is just flip over to the next slide then.
So one thing that came through in Brian's bio that didn't come through in mine, perhaps, is Brian has very much a bias, I guess, towards Exchange and email systems and the servers that support them. My bias is towards endpoint computing, desktop management, desktop deployment, and desktop security. So that's the lens that I see my world through. Perfect. So I think based on how we work together, we'll see things from different angles and hopefully be able to add some value to the conversation based on the different perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what we wanted to talk about today was just kind of demystifying the whole zero trust concept. And I know it's a word that, well, it's a marketing turn of phrase, right? Everybody's curious about zero trust. Everybody has their own zero trust solution. So what we wanted to do today was kind of outline what Microsoft's zero trust approach is, and kind of gives you some definitions around how we look at it from Microsoft's perspective, and also kind of share some experiences that Eric has had from endpoint computing, as well as some experiences that I've had through our own work within zero trust at Microsoft. And so, Eric, did you want to add anything to that, just as we kick into the traditional model, I guess, of users and devices?
Yeah, no, I think no, this is good, Brian. Let's just keep on trucking here.
All right.
I don't know if it's worth actually spending a minute on the traditional model, but I think this picture is worth 1,000 words, and really it is that historically we've always looked at corporate assets, whether they be the data, the apps, whatever those assets are, have always been self-contained in a corporate network, and behind firewalls and behind varying levels of security, with that traditional castle and moat and high walls sort of model. And things have changed a lot, certainly with the advent of cloud everything. And the cloud isn't new, but widespread adoption of the cloud is relatively new. And that's blown up this model. So most corporate assets now are spread out. They're disparate. They're all over the place. They're in corporate-owned data centers. They're in vendor-owned data centers. And when customers buy a cloud service, they have a sense of where the data might be, in which data center it might lie, but they don't necessarily have control over that. So that wall doesn't exist the way it used to.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity too, from a Microsoft perspective, I mean, Microsoft has been in the cloud computing business for a number of years now, probably starting in the late 90s with the purchase of Hotmail, right? And that kind of goes back. So we've had our fingers in the cloud space for a really long time, but now, like you said, the prevalence of cloud computing and its use case in this end user adoption and customer adoption of the cloud as a source of infrastructure as a service or software as a service, things like that. I mean, the zero trust mindset is something that really needs to be considered moving forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so kind of addressing to what you were saying there, if we go to this slide here, we can see that today's model, outlining the walls and the moat sort of analogy that you used, we've got IoT devices, home offices, employees that are working from anywhere, and personal devices coming into the landscape. So we kind of need a way to, understand that new perimeter, right? And Microsoft's approach to that is actually using identity as the perimeter.
It's the main control plane, because the perimeter of our corporate networks is something that's been under attack, and I don't necessarily mean in a hostile way, but certainly from a design perspective for years and years and years, starting with the first laptops. As people started having a reasonable ability to work away from the office and dial in. Remember dial in? Remember those days? Modems and all that crazy stuff. And then eventually, network-based connectivity through, VPNs and stuff like that. The perimeter of the network got shattered and it changed because the perimeter was now where the end user's device happened to be. So if a user was working in a hotel room or in their basement at home or in a Starbucks or anywhere in between, and they were VPN'd in, that was now the new perimeter of the corporate network. And all of a sudden, the gatekeepers in corporate security had a whole bunch of new things to worry about, because we didn't know how healthy those devices were outside the warm confines of the corporate campus, if you will.
Right. Yeah, and that kind of draws the comparison, right, between, I guess, the old world mentality and this new world mentality, right? We're no longer recognizing the boundary of the corporate walls itself, and instead have to kind of adapt to this more fluid explosion of signals, which calls out in this slide, which I think is a really great call out, because instead of tracking that local packet, we're more interested in the overall signals that we're getting from across the board. And Microsoft ingests billions of signals a day that we can then utilize to help. Sorry, go ahead.
Trillions. No.
Trillions of signals a day. Thanks. I was off by a couple million there. But yeah, no, so Microsoft ingests trillions of signals every day across all the different products that are within our cloud environments. So taking advantage of that to be able to see and understand who, what, and when things are accessing your own corporate data is crucial, right? And so the zero trust mentality builds off of that aspect. And here, I'll just flip over to this slide here. So the concept is really, it's not so much of a concept, and I think you phrased that the other day when we were talking about this, Eric. Zero trust is a mentality, right? It's not something that we purchase as a product. It's a way of thinking about security.
That's right. It's a different way of looking at things. So if all of a sudden, if you look at your IT estate in a corporation and you can no longer get your arms around it because it no longer fits in one building or one campus or collection of campuses, but it's spread out across devices that the corporation owns and manages, and maybe devices that the corporation doesn't own and manage, things like phones and BYOD devices and people's laptops and stuff like that. And it's spread into other corporations' data centers. Could it be, SharePoint Online or Exchange Online, where these are servers that are owned and operated by Microsoft that are hosting data on behalf of their customer. You might have a sales application run by Salesforce, as an example. That's another, circumstance where your corporation is buying a capability from another vendor, and they're putting their trust into that vendor, but you still have data that is critical to your operations, your business, that is in someone else's data center somewhere else. And then exacerbate that with People no longer necessarily working at the office anymore. I'm sure all of you are familiar. We've had a little thing going on for the past couple of years, kept a lot of us out of the office and working from home. It melted down a lot of corporate firewalls and gateways and stuff like that, because all of a sudden the volume of people who had to, dial in to get work done went through the roof. It was no longer just the traveling field team and salespeople and consultants and whatever, but it now became everybody, down to, accounts receivable clerks were working from home. And these are people who have historically always worked within the bounds of the corporate network. And they may or may not have been working on devices owned by their employer. They may or may not have been working in an environment that could be considered trustworthy by their employer. Who knows how good the firewall is at, Joe from AR's home. Who knows what else is happening on that laptop after hours, and who's playing Minecraft on it and downloading malware and God knows what. So you have all these different elements at play that make it exceptionally hard to control the integrity of corporate data. So what do? You have to change how you look at things. So the zero trust model that Microsoft has built for for ourselves, and it's pretty closely aligned to, I think, what the rest of the industry looks at zero trust, considers zero trust. But of course there might be some nuances, and we may use slightly different terminology here and there, but fundamentally the idea behind zero trust is we have to stop assuming that a computer, just because it's managed and inside a corporate network within the four walls of, the four physical walls of a corporate campus, is now trustworthy anymore. It's not enough to check people's identity at the door. You actually should be checking their identity at every transaction that they do. So this is the notion of we verify explicitly, and we verify everything explicitly. And like Brian alluded to earlier, the main control plane for that now is no longer really what network you're connected to. It's really around asserting who you are with assurance, and saying that, yes, I am Eric. This is my access token. This says who I am. This says what I'm allowed to do. I want to access this resource. Please let me in. And it's no longer good enough for things to be checked once and then forgotten for 8 hours or 12 hours or until the next logon session starts. So why? Because the resources that a user like me would be accessing could be in any variety of places. It could be in a corporate data center. It could be in one of dozens of Microsoft data centers, depending on the service. It could be in an Oracle data center or a Salesforce data center or an AWS data center. Who knows? The only thing that I have in common is my identity. So I have to be able to assert who I am. And then when you take that and you assert who you are with, a certain level of assurance, and this is where you back things up with multi-factor authentication or strong authentication, FIDO tokens, you name it, Windows Hello for Business, Apple IDs, I don't care, whatever it is, they're strong IDs, that's one thing. But then you also need to assert the quality or the veracity of the device that you're using to access these resources. Is this device known? Is it managed? Is it compliant to management policies? Has it been breached? Is it been jailbroken? All sorts of things like that need to be measured before the system that you're accessing will let you in. And then we can add to those layers, like, for example, the data, the applications themselves. There are things that we can do to protect the data. We can encrypt it at rest. We can encrypt it in transit. We can label it. We can tag it and give it different classifications so that people will only see, what they need to see based on their roles. Same thing goes with applications. And then on the infrastructure side, you need to make sure that this is well managed. You need to make sure that the people managing that infrastructure are doing so using strong identities, using least privilege principles, so that there isn't, you don't have a squad of domain admins or global administrators or people, running around doing sudo root on everything just because they need to make a quick change to some configuration. Administrators need to be granted privilege based on what they're doing and only for as long as they require it. So, those principles go on the infrastructure. And then finally, on the network side, even though, I mentioned a lot of the network is no longer necessarily within the corporate boundaries, and a lot of the network is outside, whether it be in Azure or AWS or Google Cloud or wherever, there are principles that can still be applied to secure your network. So segmentation and micro-segmentation, making sure that specific servers and services are behind the right levels of segmentation and firewalls, and ensuring that you minimize the ability for any device or service, whether it be authorized or rogue, from traversing the network more easily than it needs to. So these are all principles that we apply, at those 6 levels, right? So identity, endpoint, data, apps, infrastructure, and network. Those are the pillars that the Microsoft Zero Trust model stands on. And then, we back that up with this, like I mentioned, least privilege, the verification, and then we assume breach. Let's just, as a starting point, assume that the bad guys are already in. So how do you protect your environment when you know the bad guys are already in? Well, those are the measures that we would take. So we would very jealously protect endpoints as opposed to the network that the endpoint is sitting on. We would actually protect the endpoint directly as well. Same goes with identities and data and whatnot. And then you tie that up with a lot of good analytics and automation, and excellent real-time reporting, so that you can get some real-time threat analysis and remediation if required. That's our Zero Trust model in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for walking us through that. That ties into this whole idea of this digital transformation that we have to go through, through the modernization and this acceleration that we need to do. So accelerating our journey to the cloud, using modern identity and modern and management solutions, securing our hybrid workforce, like you were saying, where they are, not necessarily just behind the network infrastructure or 4 walls of our office building. Transforming our employee experiences as well, so that we're ensuring that they have this seamless access and the access that they need to their apps and resources without having them jump through hoops and have to do a lot of complicated things just to get it. MFA with the multi-factor authenticator app is super simple and very secure. So it's a great first step in that journey. And then customizing our secure access for all user types. And when I say all user types, I mean guests, I mean external users, consultants, everybody who's accessing any form of data in your environment. We need to be able to keep an eye on them, know what they're doing, and understand the signals coming from them, so that we can apply our zero trust model to it. And if we look at our maturity model, this one we really wanted to share out and kind of leave the screen up on this for a little while, because there's some really great questions that you can ask yourself as you're trying to roll out your zero trust journey and essentially adopt this mindset. So the getting started section, we're outlining the password risks that you might take. So how can we enforce strong authentication methods? These are just basic questions that you can ask yourself in your current environment as it looks. Are you doing these things, and how can you get to the advanced stage? And moving from advanced to optimal, obviously. So we're really getting into, applying the best practices and keeping conform with those best practices. And just down on the bottom left there is a link to the Zero Trust resources hosted by Microsoft. So there are a lot of really great resources on there that can help you accelerate your journey moving forward. And, definitely reach out to us at Fast Track. And Brian, I just wanted to do a time check because I didn't start a timer beforehand. I think we might be getting pretty close. Just wanted to double check.
Yeah, we still have actually 9 minutes.
Oh, 9 minutes. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so there's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot to chew on here, and some of the things to keep in mind is when we're starting to talk about things like explicit verification at every step. Obviously, we can't do that and ask a user to re-authenticate every time they want to do something. Log into the laptop, authenticate, open email, authenticate, open an email message, authenticate. print the email message or, do whatever, authenticate. No, we can't do that. So obviously a lot of the core elements have to be implemented, through modern authentication and single sign-on and those principles, and ensure that things happen as seamlessly as possible in the background. We also, as part of that zero trust model and the assumption that services are no longer in one place. We have to design the end user experience in such a way that it is as efficient as possible. I mean, if you think about, in the early days of, 2 years ago, in March 2020, March and April 2020, when people all started working from home in a panic, a lot of corporate, I joked earlier that a lot of firewalls melted down. And that's not necessarily far from the truth, because what wound up happening was, as people worked from home, they fired up their VPN clients, and the current security policy in the environment forced all traffic outbound from the PC through the VPN into the corporate network for either inspection and or redirection to on-premises services, or get sent out to the cloud to get access to, the mailbox or whatever the service might be.
Yeah.
And that might, in a circa 2008 security model look really, really good, and it gives you an awful lot of control over the traffic that's inbound and outbound, and you know exactly who's doing what and when. Challenges, that's not really scalable, especially when a critical mass of corporate services are now being hosted outside the corporate data center. They're being hosted in a Microsoft data center, an AWS data center, a Google data center, or wherever. And they're, for all practical purposes, just out there on the internet. So, being able to pivot rapidly and implement and securely implement solutions such as split tunneling that would allow a client to directly talk to the cloud service that they were requesting, while still securely routing through the VPN back to corp for whatever on-premises services were needed, made a lot of sense. And look at it from a management point of view as well. I mentioned earlier, I have a very, endpoint centric view of the world. So I think about things like maintaining the security and integrity and updatedness, if that's a word, of the clients, right? How do you ensure that your PCs are up to date, that they're running the latest, set of patches from Patch Tuesday, that they're on a recent feature update of Windows 10 if you're running Windows 10, or on the latest version of Mac OS, or whatever it might be? How do you monitor for that? How do you control for that? And how are you able to effectively do that if your devices need to VPN in to be managed? I've got customers.
Right, or you had like Windows Server update services sitting in your infrastructure, and now all of a sudden people are VPNing
straight from the cloud, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I have customers that literally spent months with devices that were never getting patched or never getting managed or never getting updated, because their VPNs were so saturated they couldn't VPN in to connect to a domain controller to update the computer's password, which is a background process that the user never sees, but when it breaks, the help desk sees that. And they weren't connecting to the Windows Server update services, or they weren't connecting to SCCM or whatever the management tool was, and they weren't getting anything new. And you had devices that were sitting there 6, 7, 8, 9 months out of date, spending their days connected to the internet. I saw in the chat earlier, someone alluded to, this is a security community. Well, guess what? We all know what one of the first rules of security is, and that's stay current. Is it acceptable to have devices out there that can spend the better part of a year without ever receiving a patch or without ever receiving an update, just because they can't talk to corp? So you need to pivot as well. So not only you're looking at applications that your end users use, but the applications that IT uses to keep your environment up to date also need to pivot. And the zero trust model, one of the underpinnings in the Microsoft version of that model is a service called Intune, or endpoint, Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And Intune allows organizations to manage their devices without the device ever needing to actually talk to the corporate network. As long as the device's identity is valid and the end user's identity is valid, and it can talk to the internet, the device is now managed. It's now patched. Its compliance is being measured. And if the device is compliant against security policy, it's going to be granted access to the crown jewels, to the corporate resources.
What's interesting too is the move now, from this, just how COVID changed so much, right? From this mentality of on-premise computing to anywhere computing, I guess you could say, and looking at just the impact that this had on the way organizations are managing their devices now. Like we went from slowly getting people to finally adopt hybrid Azure AD models with their devices, right? And now organizations are completely dropping hybrid Azure AD and going straight up Azure AD. Getting these cloud-only managed devices because honestly, it's just simpler and easier to handle and also more secure.
Yeah, exactly. If you take away the requirement for a device to have line of sight to a domain controller, that can simplify a whole lot in how you manage your environment. And to your point, it does make them more secure. So there you go.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering in the Q&A, is there anybody? I haven't seen any questions fly by. I was kind of hoping for a little bit of banter.
So from everything that we've just been talking about too, if I understand correctly, you're saying Microsoft is a security company, right?
Well, I guess actually there is Karen has a question.
Okay.
So I'll answer. I guess we'll tackle both of them. So yeah, Microsoft is a security company. It's except we don't market ourselves as a security company, but as far as Microsoft is absolutely 100% in the security business these days. It's by far the fastest growing segment of what we do, and in terms of I can't remember what the exact number is, but it's in the billions of dollars annually spent in research and development just on information security and IT security in general. And a lot of that research is turned around and baked back into some of our products, but it's also shared with the ecosystem. It goes into the cloud. It gets put up on GitHub as open source. It gets and we do security from pretty much every angle these days.
The openness of the APIs too, right? Like anybody can start developing now for Microsoft information protection, start tying that into their own software. Look at Adobe with PDFs, right? Like the other day, I think the best way for me to demonstrate how Microsoft information protection works, and I do this all the time, is sharing out a deck that I've created as a PDF, protecting it with information protection, and then sending it out to a customer and asking them to share out their screen with the PDF up. If they don't authenticate in, all that shows up is a black screen. They get to see the content, but that information is not shared out, even if they're trying to share it, if they try to print it, try to copy from it. So I mean, the tie-in and the vastness of what we can do now is just really, really interesting. And it's all based off of this zero trust model, right?
So in the chat, I saw Karen Nimani asked, how does it make it more secure? Karen, I assume you're alluding to, basically having cloud managed devices as opposed to on-prem managed devices. How are they more secure? There's a variety of ways you can look at it. AD, okay, perfect, thanks. So having the challenge with AD and using that as your only security plane is devices need to have access to Active Directory in order to be managed, right? The computer needs to be joined to the domain. Once it's joined to the domain, it has a password that has to be updated. What is it, every 30 days, plus or minus a few days in the background. So it needs constant line of sight to a domain controller. The computer itself needs, you're probably going to have group policies that are going to affect the configuration of your users and your devices and lock them down to a certain degree. And that's all great, but that is a model that was designed purely for on-premises computing. That is a model that stems from system policies in Windows NT. And it was modernized into AD in Windows 2000, which is 22 years ago. I mean, that is, and a lot has changed in how organizations compute, how end users compute, how the world computes in general. And mobility is arguably the single biggest piece of that puzzle. So when you're taking so when you make a device entirely dependent on an on-premises infrastructure in order to be managed, to be known, to be managed, to stay secure, then you're putting the onus on basically a single point of failure, which is access to your corporate network, whether that be physically walking into a building and connecting to corporate Wi-Fi or plugging into a corporate LAN, or connecting through a VPN. Now, if we take that identity plane and that control plane and move it to the cloud and move it to an area where it is more accessible to devices that are connected to the internet as opposed to a specific private network, but then we secure access to that using strong authentication, using strong identities, certificate services, and so on, we can establish basically that PC that was dependent on a relatively small network of domain controllers to get policy from, now can connect to a worldwide network of thousands, hundreds of thousands of virtual domain controllers in Azure AD, and more importantly, also access Intune or Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which is a cloud-based service whose scale is frankly unknown and irrelevant to most people because it grows and shrinks dynamically as usage goes. The device itself is now always under management. It's always seen by a control plane. Azure AD is always there verifying identity, and Intune is always there applying policy. So that necessarily and then there's some neat features and capabilities in Intune and Azure AD that on-prem AD just didn't have.
Conditional access,
conditional access, compliance management, compliance monitoring, and all these things that can happen dynamically in real time that can also be used to control access not only to your corporate systems, but to third-party cloud services that you might be subscribed to, whether they're from Microsoft or anyone else. It really doesn't matter. You can use conditional access policies that can say, hey, you know what? Karen wants access to Salesforce. And oops, her computer is not compliant because pick your reason, right? It hasn't been patched, whatever it is. We're not going to let her in.
Yep.
And that simplifies the security model, and a security that's easier to implement is inherently security that's going to be used, and it's going to be less bypassed by people, and it makes things more secure all around.
Yeah. Somebody I once heard say, the death of security is complexity, right?
And the best security is security you never see.
Yep, exactly. Just another call out too is all that telemetry. The computer talking to the cloud, you get visibility into all aspects of its daily routine and work. So,
Brian, I think we're getting the shepherd's crook here. We're being pulled off stage.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to say thanks to everybody. A few links here sharing up on the screen, some additional concepts around zero trust that you can check out and take the zero trust security posture assessment, as well as check us out. Me and Eric, we work for the fast track department in Microsoft 365. So if you need help deploying Microsoft 365 software, just let us know.